I had an ominous feeling as I gazed out into the cornfield, which was barely lit up by the moonlight. I had an unnerving premonition that something deadly awaited us inside. I was about to turn around and go home when I felt a hand grasp mine. I couldn't help but smile as I gazed down into the beautiful blue eyes of my new girlfriend, Hannah. We had only been dating less than a month, and I could already tell I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. She started walking towards the cornfield, and I knew I would look like a coward if I didn't find her. We had just passed the first few stalks when my best friend, Tony, ran up and tapped Hannah on the arm and yelled, "Tag!" before running off. A mischievous smile crossed her face as she immediately tagged me and said, "No tag backs," before doing a little curtsy and hopping away. I could hear my friends laughing in the distance as I began jogging forward to find one of them. I stopped dead in my tracks as I walked into a clearing to find a scarecrow hanging there. A shiver ran down my spine as I gazed up at him, as there was something unsettling about him. I heard a noise behind me and turned around to see what it was, but didn't spot anyone. I was about to leave the clearing when I noticed the scarecrow had turned his head and was now facing me. I walked forward on feet made of lead and tapped his body, and was relieved to discover that he was stuffed full of straw. I was almost bowled over as someone came sprinting out of the stalks and ran directly into me. I didn't even think about it and immediately tagged my mate Barry, and I saw the disappointment on his face as I jogged off. I'd only gotten a few feet away when I heard a blood-curdling scream behind me as I stood there, frozen in terror. It took me a few minutes to gain the courage to walk back into the clearing. Barry was nowhere in sight, and the scarecrow was still hanging in place. I was about to walk off when I heard a dripping noise, and I cautiously approached the scarecrow. I had to place my hand over my mouth to stifle my scream as I discovered Barry's hanging corpse in place of the scarecrow. His eyeballs had been plucked out of his skull and replaced with straw. Blood was pouring from his body, from dozens of wounds, and slowly dripping onto the floor. I began backing away until I collided with something soft. I turned around and was now face to face with the scarecrow. He kept turning his head as if studying me. I could see straw poking out from numerous places from his clothes. Tony ran into the clearing and ran face first into the scarecrow's back. He let out a grunt of annoyance and was about to run off when the scarecrow's arm shot out and gripped him by the throat. Tony was lifted off his feet, and I could see the panic in his eyes as he tried to free himself. He opened his mouth to scream, and I watched in terror as straw shot out from the scarecrow's body and into Tony's mouth. It was like a never-ending stream as it kept going until Tony's futile struggles finally stopped. Tony's body was unceremoniously dropped to the ground as the scarecrow turned his attention to me. I darted to one side and barely evaded his grip as I disappeared amongst the rows of corn. I kept glancing to all sides in the hopes of finding the edge of the cornfield. But all I kept finding was more corn. I kept spotting the scarecrow in the distance as he seemed to be hunting me. I tripped over something and let out a sob as I pushed myself up to find the bodies of two of my friends. Their heads had been ripped open, and corn had been forced down them. I let out an almost manic laugh as they reminded me of Pez dispensers. I urged myself to keep going with my one target of finding Hannah and getting us both out of here. I considered calling out her name, but knew that would probably draw unwanted attention. I was about to give up hope of finding her when I found her sobbing on the floor, clutching the body of her best friend. Their arms had been ripped from their body and lay on the ground a few feet away. I helped her to her feet and had to practically drag her along as she was almost comatose. I almost let out a howl of joy as I spotted the edge of the cornfield directly ahead. I had just reached the last row when I lost my grip on Hannah. I spun around and was almost face to face with the scarecrow. He was holding on to Hannah in a vice-like grip. I waited for him to reach for me, but he stood motionless. I looked down to discover that I was outside the cornfield and realized he couldn't leave it. He began stroking Hannah's hair, and I could tell he was trying to taunt me. Hannah seemed to finally wake up from wherever her mind had gone and began shrieking at the top of her lungs. The scarecrow flinched away for a second before placing his hands on either side of her skull. My eyes widened as I saw the straw forcing its way into her ears. She went deathly silent as I watched the straw moving around inside her eyeballs. A single tear ran down my cheek as the scarecrow pulled her mouth open and a stalk of corn began growing inside. I turned and fled, knowing that there was nothing left for me here. I returned the next day, and I stood there, immobile, gazing at all of the scarecrows scattered across the field. I began pouring the petrol at the edge of the field, whilst being careful not to step inside. I was about to light the match when each and every scarecrow turned to face me. I threw the match onto the petrol and hoped that this would avenge my friends. I was beyond irritated as we finally arrived at the excursion that my family had dragged me along to. I had wanted to spend the day with my friends, but my parents had refused as they don't like my friends. I hopped out of the car and looked around in disgust while my parents and younger brothers were chatting away excitedly. It was one of those model villages that have houses that are about 3 feet tall. I could hear my parents commenting on how intricate the design on all of the houses were. I followed slowly behind them while glaring daggers into their backs. They turned a corner, leaving me by myself, and my eyes were drawn to a tiny figurine standing outside of one of the houses. An impulsive thought hit me, and I took great pleasure in smashing my foot down and crushing the figure. My happiness was only momentary, as the sky around me went pitch black. Agonizing pain shot through me as it felt like every bone in my body was being crushed beneath a steamroller. I sank to the floor, screaming before quickly losing consciousness. I awoke a short time later and immediately looked around me in confusion. I had no idea where I was, as the model village had disappeared, and I was now standing in the middle of a picturesque street. I saw a group of people huddled nearby, and I rushed over to look for help. I moved past them to discover they were standing over the pulverized remains of some guy's body. I turned to the woman beside me, and I was about to ask her to borrow her phone, but my words got caught in my throat. Her face was distorted, and it was impossible to distinguish one feature from another. I began backing away as she raised her arm and pointed at me, before letting out an ear-splitting shriek. The others quickly surrounded me, and I pleaded with them to let me go, while trying my best not to look at their messed up faces. I almost jumped out of my skin when an explosion went off only a few feet away. I was flung to the ground with my ears ringing inside my head. I pushed myself to my feet to find the street deserted, as the others had fled inside their homes. The entire street was now being rocked by explosions, as I stood there paralyzed with fear. Something landed a short distance away, and I crept forward to investigate it. My mind was reeling as I reached it to discover a giant bubble of water just lying there. I was thrown to the ground as something smashed into my back and was engulfed in another bubble of water. I desperately tried to burst the bubble as I couldn't breathe, as water filled my lungs. I was moments away from drowning when the bubble finally burst, and I lay on the ground taking deep breaths. It took me almost a minute to finally catch my breath, and I ignored the sounds of the water bubbles falling around me. I raised my head as a thunderous sound nearby drew my attention. It was getting closer with each passing second, and I couldn't decide which way I should run. My eyes widened in terror as a mountain of water appeared and was cascading towards me. There was no chance to escape, as it struck me and I was flung along in its wake. Trees and boulders the size of trucks were being dragged along, and it took all of my strength to avoid being crushed between them. I saw a branch directly ahead. I saw that the torrent of water was heading towards a waterfall, and knew there was no way of me surviving that fall. I saw a branch directly ahead, and knew it was my only hope of survival. I reached out and somehow managed to grab onto it. I held onto it for dear life, as my body was battered by countless debris. The water slowly ebbed, and I dropped to the ground, and nursed my aching body. I moved forward slowly to see 3 giant holes. It kind of reminded me of a sewer grate, but this one was of epic proportions. I could feel someone staring at me, and I began spinning around in all directions, but I couldn't see anyone in sight. I headed back the way I had come, in the hopes of finding a phone to ring my family. I walked alongside a forest of giant, strange-looking green trees that towered over me. I could hear something moving in there that kept ducking out of sight before I could get a proper look at it. The village had just come into view when something emerged from the forest just in front of me. It was a creature of monstrous size that dwarfed anything I had ever seen before. It had 6 giant legs, the size of tree trunks, and a pair of what could only be described as antennae on the front of its head. Its beady eyes appeared to be staring into my soul as it moved towards me. It lurched itself at me, and I barely managed to avoid its grasp. It was lightning quick, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it caught me. I once again dodged it, but was thrown from my feet as one of its feet swung out and collided with me. I lay there wheezing and awaiting my fate, as there was no way I could outrun it. It began letting out excited noises, and I turned my pounding head to see it pick up some kind of boulder and rush off into the forest. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, until the pain in my body eased enough for me to stand up. The sounds of helicopters overhead made me peer up into the sky, and I fled to the edge of the forest while peering into the sky. Dozens of giant bugs were flying above me, and the buzzing of their wings awoke a primordial fear in my body as I stared at the razor-sharp tips of their stingers. I waited until they had disappeared from view before moving from cover and hobbling along the street before stopping dead in my tracks as an earthquake began shaking the buildings. I fled into the cover of one of the doorways as the faces of the occupants inside glared out at me. The sun was suddenly blocked out, and the entire street was in shadow. I looked upwards and felt my knees grow weak as I stared into my brother's face. He was a giant that was now taller than even the world's largest skyscraper. I had to cover my ears to block out his thunderous voice as he called out my name. I raced into the middle of the street and began jumping up and down and calling his name. I was overjoyed when he finally looked down at me, but a feeling of dread washed through me as a sadistic smirk broke out on his face. I watched him raise his building-sized foot upwards before realizing what he was about to do. I ran as fast as I could with my remaining strength and jumped through the air just as his foot smashed into the street directly behind me. My entire body was numb as the shockwave from his foot created a dust storm that momentarily blinded me. The air quickly cleared, and I turned around and let out a scream as I peered in horror at my crushed legs. They were now as flat as pancakes, and thankfully I had lost all feeling below my waist. My brother's deafening footsteps moved away as he continued shouting out my name. I lay on the ground sobbing and feeling sorry for myself. I was so caught up in my own misery that I didn't notice the village residents slinking back outside and surrounding me. I could feel the glee on their faces as they peered down at me. I shrunk away from one of them as they reached over and dipped their fingers into the blood from my legs and seemed to taste it. A flashing white light blinded me, and I found myself lying in the midst of the village. And I was beyond relieved, as I was once again back to my normal size. My parents emerged from around a corner, and I could see the color drain from their faces as they saw what had happened to my legs. It has now been almost 3 months since the incident, and my parents are still demanding that I tell them what happened that day. I have been begging them to go back to the model village, and they finally relented. I cannot wait to convince my brother to stomp on one of the residents so that I can finally show him the same mercy he showed me.
I'm a long-haul truck driver. I've been doing it for almost 15 years and have honestly enjoyed it. I've hauled everything from dried goods like cereal and macaroni to things like cell phones and computers. It's been a pretty well-paying career, and I've honestly enjoyed it. However, there was this one night around 10 years ago. I was hauling office supplies, such as pens and papers, halfway across the country. I'd been driving for a pretty long time, but I had a deadline to beat. I remember It was getting pretty late, but my favorite podcast was keeping me company. I guess listening to guys argue about sports made me a little less lonesome. The road got that way sometimes. Luckily, I had a beautiful fiancée waiting for me at home. But on that night, she would be the furthest thing from my mind. I remember cruising down a dark and desolate highway. Things like stores and houses were nowhere in sight. In moments like this, it felt as if I were the only person in the entire world. Although I was about to be proven very wrong. Within my view, the road was clear and empty. Suddenly, something darted in front of my truck from out of nowhere. Of course, with such a big machine, I wasn't able to simply slam on brakes and stop. To my shock, I ended up hitting whatever ran out in front of me. It must have been big, as the entire 18-wheeler shook upon collision. I came to a stop as quick as I could, fearing the worst had happened. That a person, most likely, made the mistake of stepping in front of my rig. As I killed the engine, I took a minute before exiting the vehicle. After all, if I did hit someone, my life was going to be over. Getting married, having a few kids, and watching them grow. Those things wouldn't happen with me sitting in a prison cell. But regardless, I had to check on who or whatever this was. Though I had my doubts, they survived a head-on collision with a mighty semi. Within my first few steps, I heard a small squelch sound. Upon looking down, I saw a pool of blood already starting to form. Not to mention the fact that my size 10 boot was already standing in it. That's when it hit me. This had to be a human. No animal would lose this amount of blood. It was hard to fathom. But I was positive I had just killed someone. Within a few steps, however, I would be proven wrong. Pinned under the front of my truck was not the body of a human being. Instead, it looked to be some sort of creature. Upon further investigation, I could clearly see that it was dead. As for what it was, I couldn't tell you. The thing was a beast. It had to be around 6 foot tall, seemingly a canine-like creature with fangs protruding from its mouth. It could have been a large dog, but that didn't seem right, even though it was stuck. I could clearly see its broad chest and shoulders, as well as two long and hairy legs, almost like a man's. The only thing I could compare it to would be that of a werewolf. Absolutely stumped and unsure of what to do, I called the police. While waiting around, I couldn't help but stare at this odd being. I'd never seen anything like it before, and now even a putrid smell emanated from its corpse, like that of an animal that had never bathed before. I'd be so glad when officers finally did arrive. Maybe they could make some sense of this situation. I would soon be greeted by two older men giving me annoyed looks. I'm sure they had a long day and didn't care about some dead animal. But those thoughts would change as soon as they saw this thing. Both men's eyes grew wide and their skin pale. I heard one ask the other if this could be some guy in a costume. I watched as they tried to pull it out from under my truck. As they did, the smell from earlier became even worse. Though seeing that thing's entire body for the first time left us in awe. It was so big. The arms alone were thicker than some bodybuilders, as well as sharp claws that I was sure could rip us apart with ease. I'll never forget how the one man looked as he spoke into his walkie-talkie. He then approached me and shook his head before speaking.
Mister, we don't know what you hit, but we're gonna need somebody smarter than us to figure it out. Mind waiting by the car?
He asked. Now, I did have a load to deliver, but it seemed best to comply. If I was being honest, it would be nice to figure out what was lying there. After another 20 minutes passed, a second vehicle arrived on the scene. Instead of your usual police cruiser, I saw a mysterious, all-black car. A man would step out, wearing a sharp black suit to match. He looked down at the creature for only a brief moment before letting out a loud sigh. Without saying a word, he began to approach me. I'd be lying if I said the man wasn't intimidating. Something about the look in his eyes. It was cold and calculating. Like he walked through hell and came back unscathed. I remember he looked at me and spoke in a deep voice.
They've got a lot of cleanup to do here. Let's get to the station and talk about what you saw.
Once again, I didn't resist. I willingly went along with this strange man. He drove me to a nearby police station. where I was seated in an interrogation room. I was alone at first, but soon the man would return with 2 cups of coffee. He looked down while stirring his Java and began talking. He told me that what I saw tonight was nothing more than an exotic pet, an endangered one that was actually very illegal to own. I couldn't help but giggle. I didn't believe what he said for a second. I told him that was a stretch, and that it looked more like a werewolf to me. He wasn't amused, as he slammed his hand on the table and shouted. He told me there was no such thing as a werewolf, that I needed to realize that this wasn't a game. He pushed how this was an illegal pet and wanted me to agree with him. It was the point that he said I could lose my job if I didn't comply. Without much of a choice, I assured him that what I hit was only a pet. Afterwards, he asked for my shoes and even gave me a pat down. It was all so strange. I didn't understand why he was being such a jerk. In fact, I felt downright threatened by him. After a few minutes, he brought me a pair of cheap jailhouse shoes. He told me mine were ruined by the blood and that he threw them out. I was pretty upset, as those were an expensive pair of work boots. But it was pretty obvious I had no room to negotiate. He didn't let me finish my shipment either, saying my truck was totaled out. I knew this was a lie. The front end was only lightly damaged. I ended up receiving a bus ticket and went back home. I was off the road for 2 weeks without hearing a thing. Finally, my boss would call and put me back to work. Weeks turned into months and then years. My fiance and I got married and even had a little boy. I continued to drive 18-wheelers, never having another incident like that again. My life was mostly normal, but sometimes weird things would happen. I'd receive phone calls in the middle of the night asking if I'd seen anything strange. I would say no and try to identify the caller, but they always hung up. At times I would catch suspicious black vehicles following my rig while I was driving. Perhaps it was all just a coincidence, and I prayed it was. Even so, I didn't believe what I hit that night was just a pet. As for its true identity, I'm sure it would forever remain a secret. If I'm being honest, maybe that was for the best.
The relentless blizzard outside Jack's cabin roared like a ravenous beast, rattling the frost-covered windows and threatening to tear the roof from its moorings. But even the storm's fury couldn't drown out the bone-chilling sounds emanating from the depths of the forest. Inhuman shrieks pierced the night air, a cacophony of agony and hunger that seemed to grow closer with each passing hour. Jack huddled by the dying embers of his fire, wrapped in every scrap of fabric he could find. His gaunt face was illuminated by the fading orange glow, highlighting the dark circles under his sunken eyes. His stomach growled ferociously, a constant reminder of the days that had passed since his last proper meal. The unexpected blizzard had trapped him here, turning what should have been a weekend getaway into a nightmarish struggle for survival. As he stared into the fading coals, Jack's mind wandered to the dwindling supplies in his cupboard. A single can of beans, half a pack of stale crackers, and a few tea bags were all that remained between him and starvation. He had already resorted to melting snow for water, the icy liquid doing little to sate his gnawing hunger. A sudden pounding at the door made Jack leap to his feet, his heart racing. The noise was distinct from the howling wind, deliberate, desperate. "Hello?" a voice called out, barely audible above the storm. "Is anyone there? Please, I'm lost. I need help." Jack hesitated, his hand hovering over the door latch. Opening the door meant letting in the killing cold, possibly dooming them both. But leaving someone out there in this weather? The pounding grew more insistent, the voice more frantic. "Please, I can see your light. I'm so cold, so hungry. I think I'm dying out here." Jack's own hunger twisted in his gut, a primal force urging him to act. His survival instincts warred with his humanity as he stumbled towards the door, fingers trembling on the icy metal of the latch. "Hold on," he croaked, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm coming." As he swung the door open, letting in a swirl of snow and bitter wind, Jack's eyes widened in abject horror. The thing that loomed in the doorway was no longer human, if it ever had been. Emaciated limbs stretched to impossible lengths, skin pulled taut over protruding bones and sinew. Tattered remnants of clothing clung to its gaunt frame. Atop its elongated neck, a skull-like face peered down at Jack, lips pulled back in a rictus grin that revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. Most terrifying of all, were the creature's eyes, sunken orbs that gleamed with an insatiable, primal hunger that chillingly mirrored Jack's own desperate need. Massive antlers, twisted and sharp, sprouted from its skull, scraping against the top of the door frame as the creature stooped to enter. A noise emerged from its throat, a guttural, inhuman sound that started as a whimper and rose to a shriek of triumph and hunger. Jack stumbled backwards, his scream of terror lost in the howling of the wind and the creature's unearthly cry. He scrambled for a weapon, anything to defend himself, but his weakened state and the Wendigo's supernatural speed left him no chance. The Wendigo's jaw unhinged, stretched to an impossible width as it lunged forward. Jack felt razor-sharp claws sink into his flesh. The cold of the creature's touch somehow more bone-chilling than the winter storm. As consciousness faded, his last thought was a detached wondering if this was how the Wendigo had been born. Another lost soul succumbing to the hunger and desperation in the merciless wild. When spring finally came, melting away winter's icy grip, a group of hikers would stumble upon the remote cabin. They'd note the door hanging off its hinges, the interior a scene of violence and desperation. Most disturbing would be the strange, deep scratches on the inside of the walls and door, as if something had tried to claw its way out long after the flesh should have fallen from its fingers. But perhaps most chilling of all would be the single set of inhuman tracks leading away from the cabin into the depths of the forest that seemed to whisper with secrets and hunger.